Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back again today to talk about World Trigger chapters number 246 and number 247. These chapters are titled Rokuro Wakamura Part 2 and Part 3 respectively. It's really nice to be talking about World Trigger again here on the channel because it has been a very long time since I last did it, and as you guys probably know if you're watching this video on the day of release, this is the, of course, World Trigger Christmas special. Merry Christmas to everybody who celebrates Christmas, as I do, or any other of the many holidays during this time of the year. Just happy holidays to all, and I hope you guys are all having a great day while you're listening to this. If it's on the day of publishing this on December 25th of 2024, I almost said 2025, that is next year, or at any time in between. I mean, there may be a few people who are watching this on, like, March 4th. If you are, I really want you to leave a comment down below so I know if my prediction was very much accurate here today. But as I said, last time I talked about World Trigger was in September of course, 2024 here. It was about halfway through the month, and these chapters had not yet been released by that time. Of course, these are the October chapters of 2024, released on October 3rd. And I had a hurricane in my area and just a whole lot of other videos I needed to film, so World Trigger sort of just got pushed to the back burner. But I figured last year for 2023, I did the World Trigger Christmas special where I talked about a World Trigger chapter that I think came out in November, not even December, so I was a little bit late there, but I figured, hey, why not? Let's sit down, let's talk 2 chapters of World Trigger today. Honestly, I think that if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time we've had 2 World Trigger chapters this year. Let me actually check that real quick, because if I'm not mistaken, yeah, we had 1 in March, 1 in February. Oh, we had 2 in May this year, but besides for that, these are our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. These are our, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 chapters of the year. So these are our 8th and 9th World Trigger chapters of the year, which is pretty cool for sure. And yeah, of course, as always, when talking about World Trigger, I am armed beside me with my World Trigger Volume 24, of course, with the squad listed in front of it, so I can say, okay, who's on enemy of Squad 8, and refer to everybody there. Of course, my Japanese exclusive border briefing file straight from Japan that I own 2 of for some reason. Don't ask me why, but I just do own 2 of them, and honestly, if I can get my hand on a 3rd, 4th, or even 5th, I will get my hand on it, because for as awesome of a series as World Trigger is, I want to have all of the content out there. And I also today have World Trigger Volume 23 sitting beside me, as we will get to later, as a specific moment gets brought up from these chapters. And while I did not go and reread the first part of Volume 23, because I did do a lot of rereading to do this episode today, about an hour of rereading actually, because I was like, hey, I haven't read World Trigger in a while, I have not like thought about it, so let me just go back, familiarize myself with everything that was going on here, and then let's hop into this chapter as it is. But as far as needing all of these books today, I really don't need many of them, as we mainly stay in Wakamura Squad 11 during this chapter, as we, of course, get Hyuse's whole breakdown, which we will get into here very shortly. I'm very excited to talk about it. So we don't really need all of these other characters, but we do have a few like guest cameos that are pretty fun, all things considered. But yeah, hopping into it, of course, let's talk about what happened last time on World Trigger, and of course, we had a chapter where, of course, Wakamura asked, like, hey, what does Osamu have that I do not? And Hyuse pretty much sat down and talked about all of this to Wakamura and Sasamori, Hanazaki, and, of course, Asoi, who are all in the room also hearing this at this time. And eventually there was a little bit of a phone conversation with Inukai after Wakamura said, like, hey, I used to do some shooting training with Wakamura. And pretty much the end of last chapter was Hyuse explaining all of this to Wakamura, and Wakamura being a little bit of down in the dumps, like, I never caught on to what Inukai was ever trying to do for me, right? And Wakamura is eventually like, hey, for as much as Inukai wastes his effort on me, like, hey, I need to step it up and make good on my abilities, if even just a little. And Hyuse at the end of last chapter is like, all right, then let me continue. And that is really where we start off this chapter of World Trigger. Of course, the first chapter of the day, chapter number 246, titled Rokuro Wakamura, Part 2. As we start off the chapter, of course, Hyuse is standing up in front of the entire squad here, or I actually think just in front of Rokuro, Hanazaki and Sasumori. I think Asoi is back in her operator room taking care of all of the operator notes that she has to take before she goes to bed at night, right? But Hyuse standing up here says, like, okay, guys, first off, I'll be taking a cue from my teacher's methods as I attempt to answer all of your questions, Rokuro, right? And Hanazaki just says, like, oh, your teacher's that somebody at Tamakoma? And Hyuse is like, oh, no, it's my Canadian teacher. And, of course, he is talking about his teacher from After Kotor, actually. But we just get a little, like, whole thing of, like, hey, in this situation, Canada does equal After Kotor, so ha 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 ha. I love the Hyuse's Canadian joke. It's so good every single time, right? But Hyuse just says, like, hey, the first question that you posed earlier, Rokuro, was what does Osamu have that Rokuro does not? But before Hyuse can, like, start to go down this path and dissect this, the first thing that Rokuro asks is, like, hey, actually, hold on a second, Hyuse. First, could you describe what capability means? As, of course, in the last chapter, Rokuro had said something about the capability of Tamakoma 2 and Osamu compared to Rokuro's capability, right? And even Sasumori and Hanazaki are like, oh yeah, capability, that was the word you used earlier, right? And Wakamura just is like, hey, in a broad sense, I get what you mean when you say that Mikumo is more capable than me, but what I don't get is how you're defining that term specifically. Like, where exactly is this gap emerging, right? As we see a little bit of an image of, like, a capability gap in between Wakamura and Osamu, as we see that Osamu is on a higher tier and Wakamura is on a different tier. And we see that Osamu's like, oh man, look at this. It's not that huge of a gap, but it still is a gap between your capability. Well, Hyuse just says, like, hey, when it comes to thinking about capability, there's no need to overthink the matter. In broad terms, capability translates directly to results. And Wakamura's like, oh, results? As Hyuse just is like, hey, for instance, imagine you were a pair of taiyaki chefs. And Sasumori and Hanazaki are like, oh, do you mean like those small, like, fish-shaped pastries? And Hyuse just continues on saying, like, hey, imagine one one baker of taiyaki. One of them sources his ingredients carefully and follows the manual to the letter. He prepares the food with precision and practice zealously. As we see an image of Wakamura, of course, making all of these taiyaki buns, we get this idea of, like, okay, yes, he is somebody who follows by the books, gets all the ingredients, measures it out perfectly to the recipe, and gets the job done. While another chef ignores all of the instructions, eyeballs all of the measurements, and makes up her own processes. Her knowledge consists of just the bare minimum needed to keep the business going. As we see an image of course, Kotori here, who is, of course, the exact opposite of Wakamura in many, many different ways, and seeing her strategy to doing it. But Hyuse just says, like, hey, which chef is more capable in this situation? Well, the deciding factor is really whether the taiyaki they produce tastes good. As we see an image of two food stalls, of course, one being Wakamura's and one being Kotori's, and Kotori's just has a lot more customers coming up and buying taiyaki from it, right? And Wakamura sort of, like, it looks a bit puzzled at this, like, analogy that Hyuse is given, and Sasumori even says, like, hey, I mean, I get it. It's all about results, like you said, and, like, is that all that capability stands up for? And Hanazaki just is like, hey, and also going with this metaphor, is Mikumo bound to become a taiyaki master chef? But Hyuse just is like, no, not quite. At Tamakoma 2, it's actually Yuma and Chika doing all of the taiyaki cooking. Rather, Osamu has a talent for hawking the taiyaki, as we pretty much see that, yes, while both Chika and Yuma are making good taiyaki, and they're the ones bringing in that capability, we see that Osamu's capability lies in with marketing and bringing people up to the food stall, people who may not know of it before, to sell more of that taiyaki. Pretty much getting the whole idea, as Hyuse goes on to say, like, hey, Osamu wouldn't add much to the business of doing any of the cooking himself, but he has the capability to contribute in a much different way. He's been proving that throughout this selection exam. In other words, the capability I speak of is the ability to have a net positive effect on the results. And in terms of the rank wars, it's a talent for guiding one's squad much closer than victory. As such, capability is bound to be evident in the outcome. Those in pursuit of capability can only do so via results. As Wakamura just thinks in this moment of course, his captain Kotori, as after if I'm not mistaken, this was after the final rank war battle that we saw, of course, as I've got my World Trigger Volume 3 here, it was between Kotori's squad, Sua's squad, and Dazu's squad, where Kotori ended up pulling out the spider, and it was that really cool moment of, oh my gosh, Kotori, you're so cool! At least I thought Kotori was cool, because Kotori is one of my favorite characters in a World Trigger in general. But she just says, like, hey, like I keep saying, this just reflects the limits of our current power, showing this idea of where that capability maxes out, because that's where your results stop coming in. And Hanazaki sort of says, like, okay, well, I get what you're saying, Hyuse, but, like, could someone be uber strong, but whenever you have a bad spawn point, they're bound to lose there anyway? As we see during the Ikoma squad match and Tamakoma match, I think that was also where Yuba squad was introduced, and OG squad was also in that battle, if I'm not mistaken. I need to reread the rank wars, I need to do it very, very bad. But we see the image of, like, wherever Hyuse was brought into the battle, but he was almost cut down very easily by, oh, who is this guy? I know that he's on Ikoma squad, I just don't know what his name is in general. Let me scan my booklet here real fast. If he is on here, oh yeah, Kai Mina Misawa. Yeah, Kai Mina Misawa. And yes, he is from Okoma Squad. I was correct there. But whenever he cut down Hyuse very early in whatever rank war round that was, right? But Hanazaki just is like, hey, does a loss like that reflect their general capability? And Hyuse sort of pauses for a moment before just saying, well, in real life war, it does. Because in real life war, whenever you're dead, there's no more getting results after that. Like, your capability is maxed out at a certain point. As Hyuse just is like, hey, in life and death battles, present us with unique, never-before-seen triggers, and foes who appear insurmountable at a glance. As we, of course, think to the first after Krator invasion, when all of the new neighbors came in and nobody at Border knew what those triggers were. They didn't know what to expect. Like, okay, Okoma has his famous Okoma whirlwind, right? And all of this other stuff. It was like nobody knew, and we just see images of all of the various the characters there. I mean, we see Hyren, Rambean, Mira, Inadora, and Visa all like lined up here. And of course, it's like, yeah, nobody knew what to do with those triggers, but still, their capability, they got the results and got through it in the end. As Hyuse also just continues like, hey, cursing one's misfortune and the unfairness will do no good whatsoever. When facing such challenges head-on, striving for more optimal results is how one's capability is tested. As we see the heroes doing all of their things, of course, whenever Yuma went through and, like, punched a hole straight towards Visa. Of course, Hyuse fighting off against Jin, and Jin winning in the end. And, of course, Osamu's final stand to get to Tryon Cube and lure them away from Chica's location, and eventually throwing Replica onto the Africator ship. Just, oh, such an amazing moment. Like, I love early World Trigger, and I love this part of World Trigger too, but, like, you cannot beat the first Africator invasion, right? But Hyuse just continues even more saying, like, hey, the rank wars are intended to prepare us for a true battle, so losses due to unlucky, reasonable rolls of the dice still reflect one's capability, as we are challenged to make the best of a suboptimal situation. Like, as he says, like, hey, if you get a bad spawn point, you're just going to die in war too. It's not like the rank wars, like, it's trying to prepare you for every single one of these situations. Sasumori then just says, like, hey, so capability has to account for bad luck also. But Hanazaki just says, like, hey, while it is high-minded stuff, it's not just luck, it's your capability, right? But Rokuro eventually just says, like, okay, so great, results reflect capability. In that case, how does Mikumo produce better results than me? And Hyuse just says, like, hey, I suspect the answer is a difference of leeway or wiggle room between the two of you, right? And we see Wakamura's like, so you're saying the reason I don't win is because I don't have any wiggle room? But Hyuse just like, no, that's actually backwards, Wakamura. Like, hey, it's Osamu who has no margin for error. As Hyuse just is like, hey, let me ask you this. What is your goal, Rokuro? And what is Kotori's squad goal? And Rokuro just is like, hey, I mean, my goal, I want to achieve a master class as gunner. Of course, that's getting 8,000 points and becoming a master gunner, pretty much, right? While Kotori squad's main goal is promotion to A rank, right? And of course, after he gets these, Hyuse asks, okay, now tell me, Rokuro, what is the deadline for all of those achievements? And Rokuro just is like, well, I mean, there's not really any deadline, really. As Hyuse's like, okay, this is becoming clear. Tamakoma 2 has a concrete goal and a clear deadline. As Sasumori and Hanazaki are just like, oh yeah, it's the away mission this season, right? As we get the idea of like, hey, that was much was said during the press conference wherever Osamu went up and like proclaimed to everybody like, hey guys, neighbors are stealing our children, right? Whenever that event happened a long time ago. And Hyuse just is like, hey, I know I'm lacking a bit in the specifics myself, but Osamu seems to have a personal reason for why he must take part in the away mission. And that is, of course, like a myriad of factors, like to help out Yuma, to get Chika's friend back, to do all of the various things. Like Tamakoma 2 has many a reason to go to the neighborhood and go on the away mission, right? As Hyuse just says, like, hey, that sort of looming necessity is often a factor that incentivizes growth. And it's one obvious difference between you and Osamu. But Wakamura's like, no, hold on for a second, Hyuse. You're saying that having a deadline matters that much? And Hyuse's like, yeah, in Osamu's case, it certainly does. And he says, so now, to paraphrase my own teacher, when one's objective has no hard deadline, due recognition of one's failures is difficult. And of course, as we see as he talks about his teacher, we see an image of Vista appear on the screen as somebody we have not heard of in a long time and who may or may not be coming up later in this chapter, right? But Sasumori just is like, hey, a failure, like, what do you mean, like, to recognize failure? And Hyuse just is like, hey, it is through awareness of what has been lost that we reckon with our own failure. As we see an image of Hyuse walking through a kitchen, and he suddenly drops a coffee cup on the ground. So all of the coffee, or tea, whatever it is, I just automatically go to coffee, because I don't drink coffee, I don't really drink tea either, but like, the whole idea of like, oh no, like, crying over spilled milk, you are aware of what you have done, and once you're aware of it, you can reckon with that failure. It sort of reminds me of like the whole stages of grief sort of thing. Like, until you're able to actually acknowledge everything that's happened, you can't move forward in coming to terms with the grief. Hyuse just continues. Moving towards one objective may demand time, effort, and monetary resources, trust, and external evaluation. Through the awareness of things that have been lost, we can recognize the failure to achieve a goal. However, when no clear deadline for that goal exists, one can indefinitely postpone a firm declaration of either a success or failure. As we see an image of Wakamura just saying like, hey, yeah, I mean, I'm making zero progress, but I'm still here in the middle of this challenge, and I've got no results to show for it. But it's sort of the whole idea of like, hey, if life wasn't finite, would we ever get anything done? It's sort of just like one of the ideas that like I get brought up when thinking about what Hyuse is saying, like, hey, we've got to have a deadline to be able to reckon with failure whenever it happens, so we can grow and learn from our mistakes and get even better, right? As we now cut to an image after Hyuse has said all of this, where his master, of course, Visa, was teaching him somewhere in After Tour. As we see that Visa is like standing on what looks like a bench somewhere, and we see that Hyuse has brought a little chair, and we see an image of like young Hyuse, which is just really, really cute to see. As we see Vista is just like, so Hyuse, so you see, because the resources invested are bound to pay for themselves upon success, one may convince oneself that nothing of value has truly been lost just yet. And by not imposing a firm time limit, one is merely turning a blind eye to the value of time invested and lost. So long as one is blissfully unaware of these lost resources and time, there's no hope of grounded reflection and improvement. It's no better than marching in place. As we now cut back to the present after, we see that Vista is given this whole sort of thing about like, hey, marching in place is where you go if you cannot look upon yourself and understand what you have done wrong. As we see that Sasumori just is like, man, your teacher was really harsh was a harsh one, you say, right? And we see that Hanazaki's like, yeah, definitely the type to beat you over the head with the hard truth. But Hyuse just says like, hey, this was like a very extreme example of him warning me that I'm giving you here. But the salient point is that setting a deadline is one way to confront one's results in earnest, right? As Rokuro just thinks about this and remembers the last chapter whenever the whole stuff with Inukai was being revealed, and the whole idea of like, hey, Rokuro, in that time, what have you actually gained? And Rokuro is coming aware to this that he actually won nothing, right? Hyuse just continues in like, hey, Osamu has not had the luxury of marching in place. He is forced to confront the challenges at hand and his own deficiencies because he lacks the wiggle room to postpone those reckonings. As we get an image here of Osamu in two different situations, one where he's like, hey, he's got wiggle room, and one where he does not have wiggle room, right? And we see in both situations, Osamu's thinking like, hey, my try-on capacity is so low. In one situation, the one where he has wiggle room, is like, hey, my trying capacity is so low that given my lack of talent, is there a point in really even trying? While with no wiggle room, it's like, hey, my trying capacity is low, so I'd better chart a different path to victory. It's that whole idea of like a learning brain that, of course, I think they really shoved down my throat whenever I was in like grade school going through it, where they're like, hey, you've got to have an attitude about learning. Like, you can't say, like, I can't learn math, because if you say I can't learn math, then, I mean, you're sure as hell not going to learn it. But if you just trust in yourself and says, hey, this is going to take some time, but I can do it, over time, you're going to get better results than if you just say, oh, no, I'm bad at this, I can't do it. Which is a very good point to look at it in the general scheme of things. And, like, that's something that I know has helped many of kids in my generation and age. Like, hey, this is how we get through challenges. We just got to have a positive attitude about it. If we have a positive attitude about it, it doesn't mean everything's going to be going right in the end. It just means that we're going to be at a better spot than we were before. And that is sort of what this whole idea is getting across for Osamu and Rokuro here. Is like, hey, without wiggle room, you can't march in place, right? As Hyuse just continues like, hey, ultimately, Osamu's strength is in a high quantity of high-quality ideas, and his approach allows him to capitalize on that strength. Sasumori just says, like, so what you mean is that his low try-on and looming deadline forced him to specialize as a guy who pumps out a lot of usable ideas? And Hyuse's like, yeah, I mean, precisely. And he just says, like, hey, imagine if Osamu did have extra leeway. He might prefer to learn on a sheer battle prowess, right? As we just see a little image of Osamu just saying like, hey guys, I'll show you all that a low try-on dude can get it done. And we see Kikuchihara and Kitora just calling him like, look at this arrogant jerk. Like, it's going to take him forever and he's not getting any results because he's just standing in place doing nothing. He is marching in place, as the key term of this chapter goes. Hyuse just is like, hey, yeah, it would be likelier to wind up marching in place. Literally what I just said without reading the chapter. Look at this. I'm good at predicting world trigger. Hanazaki then just says like, hey, so hearing all of this, it seems about less and less that Mikumo is so amazing, and more like you're telling us all that we're just dragging our feet compared to him. And Hyuse looks over to him and just says like, hey, I mean, I don't mean to show contempt for you or anyone else. After all, Border's policy is to encourage freedom rather than motivate via pressure. And he says, hey, naturally, that approach engineers strength and creativity. As we see images of all of these people from Border, and that is exactly what it has done for them. As letting people do what they want, giving them freedom and not pushing something down their throat, gives them more opportunity to learn about themselves. I mean, Going back to more learning in school, because I think that's a perfect metaphor for what Hyuse is going over here. I mean, just think about any time you ever had to read a book in a reading or English class, right? It was probably boring, but it was probably boring because you didn't want to do it. If you really wanted to go off the shelf and pick up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Frankenstein to Modern Prometheus, as I'm pretty sure that's what the actual name of it's called, you would enjoy it much more than if you're being forced to read it for a class. And whenever I'd read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I was decently excited about it, but I was mainly able to get through it because I was like, okay, I want to read this, I'm interested in it. And, like, imagine if a teacher assigned you to read World Trigger in a classroom. Like, of course, that's not, like, something that will happen, but just think about it. If a teacher were to do that, you'd be more likely to be into it to sit down and read it than, or if you wanted to read it, than if you were reading it on your own. I hope that sort of analogy made sense, because I think I sort of lost my point halfway through there, right? But we just see all of these border members of, like, we see Arifune, Suwa, oh gosh, what is his name? Is it Azuma? Yeah, Azuma, Arifune, Kikuchihara, Oji, Ikoma, and Taichi. And Hyuse just is like, hey, that said, Tamakoma 2 added to its own constraint learning during the rank wars, being like, hey, they had a goal of the away mission selection speedrun pretty much, and they were going towards that goal. And Hyuse just is like, hey, I am convinced that this forced Osamu to choose a different path than many other agents because he had this freedom. And it is at this point that I have to admit I've got to pause the video real quick, and I will be back. I mean, you're going to hear me in a second, but I got to take a pause from recording, and then we'll get back to Rokuro's thoughts on everything Hyuse has just said. So I'll be back now for the World Trigger Christmas Special. Alright, and we are back now after that slight delay we had in the actual filming of this video, but like I said, you guys don't actually see any of that in the long run, right? So we continue on with this chapter with Wakamura just sort of saying after Hyuse went on his whole thing is Wakamura just says like, hey, so do you mean like if I sit down and start to impose my own deadlines and start to pressure myself that I'll wind up with the same strong suit as Mikumo? And after hearing this, Hyuse is a bit quiet for a second, as even Hanazaki just, like, looks up at Hyuse and just says, like, oh man, like, he is very deep in thought during this, like, isn't he, right? And Hyuse just says, like, hey, Rokuro, tell me, why exactly do you want to emulate Osamu? And Wakamura just is like, hey, well, isn't it obvious? I want to be better and achieve more. I'm after some sort of weapon that'll let me compete against those who've got what I'm lacking. I want something that'll change me for the better. And we get this really cool panel here where we see that, like, the grand majority of it is made up of a lot of these characters, and they're sort of all implanted all in Rokuro's hair in this moment, as it's just a really cool panel layout and design. And we see, like, Katori there makes perfect sense as being his captain. We see one of the A-rankers from A-rank squad number 4. I forget his name, but we see a bunch of, like, various A-rankers, and we see Inukai there. We see Izumi's there. Teruya, Osamu, Nasu. We see a bunch of these, like, just characters here in this collage spread. As Hyuse just says, like, hey, so does this suppose that something necessarily exists, Wakamura? And he says, like, hey, think about gathering up the answers and conclusions arrived at does not equate to experience of your own. Is that not what Inukai was trying to communicate? As we get a visual of Wakamura holding a flower pot that has a nice tulip growing out of it, and of course one of the metaphors that I think it was one that Hyuse had used last time was about Wakamura not knowing how to grow a flower from scratch because he does not have that experience. He does not know how to nurture that seed and let it grow. So in that same vein, if he is just given an answer and doesn't search for something on his own, it's almost like you're handing him the answers and he's not taking the time to figure out how to get to those answers. So at the end of the day, is it really that same level of have you actually learned something? As Hyuse just continues saying like, hey, well, you spend time searching for that special something, your competition is steadily progressing via standard efforts. As we see another image here of where Wakamura is off in a park somewhere, And we see that he's using a magnifying glass on the grass as he's just thinking like, oh, look at this. The secret to being better must be around here somewhere. As we see, I think it is Kashio, if I'm not mistaken. Let me find it in my World Trigger data book if I can find it. Where's Mizukami? Yeah, it's Kashio and Teruya who are sort of running by, like actively progressing in their own like gifts and making progress via the standard efforts, as Hyuse says. Wakamura sort of like dallying around in the grass, right? And Hyuse just says like, hey, turning away from the reality before you and holding out hope for the chance of some imagined magic bullet is the very definition of marching in place. And Wakamura's like, hey, so what you're saying is that everyone else is so special, instead I've just been the one standing still and going nowhere this whole time? And Hyuse, without like holding any bars, just says like, yes, that seems more than likely. And Hanazaki's just like, hey, but at the end of the day, Bikumo's approach isn't something that someone else can copy, is it? And at this point, Hyuse just says like, hey, well, think about it this way. When Tamakoma 2 lost in round 4, the optimal strategy Osamu chose was to ask Jean to join the squad. And we see that all of the guys in here, of course, Wakamura, Hanazaki, and Sasumori, are all like, wait, what, that actually happened? And I don't know if we actually knew that Hyuse had said this happened before, or if he just got told at some other point, or if we saw him get told by Osamu or Jean at some point. But really, I need to do a full reread of World Trigger at some point in my future, right? But Hyuse just says like, hey, as we all know, that didn't come to fruition, but I doubt there are many who could have done such a thing. A deadline is a weighty thing with the power to compel, and I suspect Osamu feels that more keenly than others. As we remember on that roof, of course, nobody else knows this in the moment, but of course, during that time, Osamu just thought like, hey, Yuma doesn't have much time left because, of course, his body is decomposing in his ring, of course, his black trigger. So it's a very serious thing to where it's like, yeah, he doesn't have much time left to be able to save himself. And so Osamu, wanting to get to Africator and get to the neighborhood, said, I have a deadline, so this must get done. As Hyuse just says like, hey, each of us grapples with different variables, so while emulating the external actions of someone else may be doable, emulating their internal state is not. I could elaborate on the differences between you and Osamu all day, Wakamura, but you would walk away with no tangible gain. As I said as much earlier, and now I have explained why. As we see that Wakamura is just sitting here just thinking like, wow, he's being serious. No amount of advice can really help me. Copying capable agents won't work either, so as he just thinks in his mind, as he just looks up to Hyuse and just is like, okay, right, so can you tell me what I can do to at least try to improve? As Hyuse, of course, he has an answer to this, and he just says like, yes, one potential approach comes to mind, and he says, hey, you must leave Kotori's squad. And Wakamura is like, oh, seriously? And Sasumori's like, leave the squad? And Hyuse's like, yes, the root of the problem lies within Kotori's squad, as I'm about to explain. As we end chapter number 246 of the series here, on this really serious note of like, hey, I'm about to explain why. And this is one of those scenarios in World Trigger where it's like, okay, this is a perfect place to stop a chapter, and I'm also really excited that we have another chapter to talk about in this video, as of course, on the same day, of course, we got chapter number 247 that came out, which we're just going to hop right into because, I mean, why not? We see as, of course, Hyuse says, hey, I'm about to explain all of this going on. We see that he takes a marker out and goes over to the whiteboard in the room and draws like a little bit of a stepped ladder in a way. As we see on it, he has a few tiers, of course, a C rank tier, a B rank bottom tier above it, a B mid, a B top, an A rank, and then a level above the A rank tier. And we see that everybody is lined up here, as we see that we've got we have four major players that Hyuse is showing off here. We see that we have Tachikawa, Kotori, Rokuro, and Osamu. Osamu is sitting at B tier bottom. Rokuro is at B mid, Kotori is at A rank, and Tachikawa is on that step above A rank, right? Or it may be that Osamu's at C rank, Rokuro's at B bottom, Kotori's at B top, and Tachikawa's at A rank. You can read it a few different ways. I don't know exactly how they're intending you to read it here. But Hyuse sort of like just points up to this board as he puts all these like magnetic tiles on here and just says like, all right, guys, this diagram outlines a relative combat level in solo battles. As he says like, hey, Osamu places below you, Rokuro. And he says like, hey, now let us switch to prowess into team battles. As he says like, hey, Osamu winds up above you. As we see that Rokuro has stayed where he is, but Osamu moves up to the level that Kotori was at the B rank top, right? And when we see that Hyuse also makes stuff like, hey, I've also excluded Tachikawa's token here, because I don't know enough to actually judge him in the grand scheme of things, right? And Hyuse just turns to Rokuro and says, okay, do you have any thoughts so far? And Rokuro takes a look at this and just like says, well, I mean, I really did drop down to mid B, so I can't exactly whine about that. But setting aside the solo battles, isn't Yoko placed too high for the team battles? As Wakamura sort of makes his point, just saying like, hey, there have been plenty of times when she's escaped a hairy situation, only thanks to input from Hannah, our operator. And of course, this is information that Hyuse did not have, and he's like, okay, is that so? Fine. Excluding the operator support from the equation, Kotori drops down by 1 level. As we see, it's now Rokuro at B mid, Kotori at B top, and Osamu at the A rank tier. Or maybe it's Rokuro at B bottom, Kotori at B mid, and Osamu at B top, right? But Hyuse is like, okay, no issue with these positions, I take it, right? And we see that in his mind, Rokuro is like, well, I still like he's placed Yoko a bit too high, but he ends up just saying out loud, like, okay, no issues, I guess, right? And Hyuse just is like, hey, so would you say this aligns with your perception of things, Wakamura? And Wakamura is just like, I mean, sure. But Hyuse then walks up and says, actually, this diagram has one thing wrong. As he picks up Wakamura's token and moves it all the way down to the C rank tile. As he says, Wakamura, your true position is down here. And we see that Wakamura is very freaked out by this and like, oh, what in the world? And we even see that Hanazaki's like, yeesh, man, that's harsh, right? But pretty much Hyuse explains like, hey, in preparation for this selection exam, I rewatched every match from the season involving you all, my ad hoc squad mates, right? And he says like, hey, my takeaway during the team battles is that you, Rokuro, have yet to reach a level at which you can compete and how your allies ought to act. And we see that Sasumori's just, Sasumori has to hold Hanazaki back because Hanazaki's like, come on, dude, go easy on him, right? But Sasumori understands what's going on here, just like holds him back like, hey, Rokuro needs to hear it. It's sort of showing that like, Sasumori has a lot more of an emotional understanding than Hanazaki does at some point, right? Hyuse then just continues on with his massive explanations. He just says like, hey, allow me to state my conclusion. The root of your problem, Rokuro, is that Kotori is just too competent. And Wakamura's like, are you serious that like Yoko is really that good? And Sasumori's even like, too competent? Is that like an actual possible thing to be? But Hyuse says like, hey, from its inception until it reached the upper realm of B rank, Kotori's squad came up against no true wall. Most of the combat points were earned by Kotori herself, and she certainly does fine work as the team's ace. But for your part, Rokuro, you sailed over a wall you ought to have crashed into and were carried straight to upper B rank. While other squads utilized every member's strength to make that climb one step at a time, your squad's ace sent you rocketing up the mountain in a single burst. As we see another image of here where like the whole team is at C rank, and then they just do a massive jump from C rank all the way to the B of the top, right? Or the B rank tops. As Hyuse just continues to say like, hey, Rokuro, you were never given an opportunity to learn the fundamentals of team battles. Were you? As we see in this moment that Rokuro's world suddenly like starts to spin in his mind, and he just thinks, wait, is that really true? as he just thinks like, hey, I mean, it's undeniable. In that final match, I had no clue what I should have been doing that entire time. Like, I thought I was learning to handle parallel thinking from Inukai, and yet, what popped into my head wasn't winning strategies in that moment, but fears and worries, and nothing but those. And he just thinks like, hey, all of that meaning that all of this time, I've been even weaker than I imagined. As we, of course, get this image of, like, the whole idea of, like, hey, yeah, during that final Rank Wars match we saw between Katori Squad, Tsuo Squad, and Hyuse Squad, like, Rokuro had no idea what he was doing that entire time, and if you reread that section, you get a good idea of that. And we get this very, very interesting panel here of Rokuro sitting in his chair and looking down, and as he looks down, he sees his legs just crumbling out from underneath him, right? And Hyuse then just sort of speaks up again, just saying like, hey, my personal take in this situation is that those who find themselves marching in place tend to be challenging walls more insurmountable than they realize. Rokuro, you believe you've been endeavoring to make this jump, which in fact is the wall I see looming before you. As we see this whole idea of like, okay, Rokuro thinks he's at the bottom of B rank and that he's slowly trying to build his way up to the B of mid rank, right? But in reality, he's on the ground all the way to C rank, but he has no possible steps up to B bottom to then being going up to B mid. He's just simply at the bottom and has no easy way to climb up on his own. And Hyuse just continues to say like, hey, as if someone who can't even add or multiply were trying to perform a complex computation. Under those conditions, nobody could be expected to arrive at a suitable solution. This is like, hey, your tendency to endlessly march and search for external answers is likely rooted within this set of circumstances, right? As we see this in our image of Rokuro just sitting at a desk like, hey, pondering is getting me nowhere, someone help, I am in desperate need of an answer, sort of showing that thing of like, hey, you rooting around for the right answer is a product of you never being able to try to find the answers in the first place, right? And Hyuse just says like, hey, and to solve this problem, you must truly know yourself and pick a challenge more appropriate to your level. And thus, this is why I say you should leave Katori Squad and gather allies on your own, and begin the slow march up from the bottom rung. You will surely find yourself growing more capable than ever. And Hanazaki's like, okay, Hyuse, we get what you're saying, but isn't leaving his squad for that simple reason? I mean, that just seems really, really harsh. But Hyuse is like, hey, I mean, setting a deadline or leaving his squad are both possible measures to take, and it's just a different approach that gets the job done, then so be it. Like, he doesn't need to do whatever I say here, and even says that next, like, hey, either way, Rokuro, I mean, the decision is yours. Clearly saying, like, hey, I'm just giving you the ideas that I have. You don't need to follow what I'm saying, but these are just my simple suggestions to you. As we just see that Wakamura is just sweating here in his seat, as he's just silent for a few minutes, until he eventually just speaks up and says, okay, what if, say, I do start over from scratch, but what if I can't even make it up that first step? What if I never had what it takes to make it up that first step to begin with? Then what would I do? And we see that both Sasamori and Hanazaki are just like, man, poor Rokuro. And Hanazaki in specific's like, do you see what you're doing, Hyuse? The guy's confidence is totally shot. You're ruining everything that he's been doing this entire time. But Hyuse just cuts everybody cold and close and just says, hey, Rokuro, you subdivide. Determine what you need to do to make that major first step, and subdivide that goal into smaller ones to create steps you're capable of surmounting. As we see that in this step to getting from C rank to the bottom of B rank, he needs to make smaller steps in between there to build his way up. As it's like, hey, infer meaning from enemy/ally positions, learn to rank actions by priority, use terrain to your advantage, run faster. And if he can slowly build up these things, he can slowly build his way up to the very top. And Hyuse just says like, hey, this process can simply be summed up as raw effort. If you put in the effort, Hyuse, if you put into effort, Rokuro, you will get there. As we get into a really interesting panel of Wakamura just sitting here, and we just see that he's just sitting in a black void almost. As we see that he's taking his time just sitting here, as Sasamura even has to come in and be like, hey, Rokuro, are you there? Like, hey, Rokuro, like, you there? But we just see that Rokuro is just trapped in his own mind, as he just thinks, right, just now, it finally clicked for me, and I get it now. I'm totally terrified of learning that I'm actually and truly incompetent. That fear drove me to set myself up to fail, and that fear drove me to pursue answers from others. But say I carve up those goals into the tiniest sub-goals possible. Say I get all my ducks in a row to a point that even a worthless idiot like me could succeed with a little effort. If that's not even enough for me to climb the first real step, I'll just be proving that I'm hopelessly incompetent. As we get an image of Rokuro actually trying to walk up these steps, and what he's done is instead of building these bigger stairs, he's using bricks trying to put one thing at a time, but we see that his brick tower is just fallen over, and it's just a lot of rubble, not even letting him step up to a higher tier. As he just continues to think like, hey, confirming that truth for myself is my greatest fear of all. As we cut back into the main reality, where we see that it's just like an ocean of silence almost, that Hyuse eventually breaks by just going like, hey, Rokuro, can you ride a bicycle? And this, of course, really catches Rokuro off guard, and really both Hanazaki and Sasamura too is just like, hey, what does this have to do with literally anything? But Rokuro just is like, I mean, yeah, I can. And Hyuse just is like, okay then, well, you'll be fine. From what I hear, you are capable of this, right? And we see that Wakamura's like, I mean, but anyone can ride a bike though, like that doesn't mean anything. But of course, Hyuse is like, well, I cannot. And we see that everyone's like, really, you can't ride a bike? And I love Hanazaki's comment of like, for real, like, are you saying they don't have bikes over in Canada? And Hyuse is a little bit caught off by this response, as he just thinks back to Yuma, where they were riding the bike under the bridge before they were going to the draft. As we see that Yuma is just like, hey, the ground on this planet is relatively flat, so knowing how to ride a bike comes in handy. So, of course, like in the neighborhood, that's not how the terrain necessarily is, and Hyuse sort of uses this to formulate his response of like, hey, I hail from the mountainous biome of Canada, and a bicycle would be a hindrance up on those alpine paths. And Sasamura's like, oh, you don't say, do you? And Hanazaki's like, man, Canada's natural terrain sure sounds rough. Like, I don't even know if I ever want to go there, right? But Wakamura just is like, okay, well, Canada is one thing, but being able to ride a bike is taken for granted here in Japan. I mean, besides, even with the same bike, there'd be a huge difference between a plebeian like me and a serious cyclist. As we just get this image of Rokuro like, hey, I can drive at 20 kilometers an hour, but an actual cyclist using my same bike would maybe be able to go 60, right? So it's this whole idea of where Rokuro's just beating himself up on these smallest things that really don't matter, right? And Hyuse even says just like, hey, this has nothing to do with anyone but you. Don't think about anybody else and their progress, think about your own. As Hyuse just says like, hey, the fact that you can ride a bicycle tells us that through training you can learn to do something you were once incapable of, Rokuro. And he's like, does all of this make sense? And we see that Rokuro's eyes sort of light up with a little bit of a spark in this moment, as he just like thinks about everything in this moment, as Hyuse just continues saying like, hey, do not be constrained by the bicycle analogy. This could apply to mastering chopsticks or whatever have you. Recall every one of the many times you grew capable of something. In the meantime, subdivide your goals as much as needed to make them obtainable. And I'm sure you are going to improve. Through this, you will gain confidence. As we get this image of Rokuro finally putting that final brick into place and building his steps up to the next rung in this image, as we cut the scene here between, of course, Rokuro and Hyuse, and we have one more page of the chapter where we see that we in squad number 11's barracks for the night. We see that Hanazaki and Rokuro are both sharing the double room tonight, as we see that Rokuro sort of has like a glazed over expression, just like thinking about everything that Hyuse has said to him today and everything that's happened, as we just see that Hanazaki's like, man, I wonder if Rokuro's head got done in by all of this. Like, I hope he's okay. And that is where we end this chapter, really focusing on Rokuro's eyes and how Rokuro is going to grow on the outside of this. And that is where we end chapter number 247, of course, called Rokuro Wakamura Part 3. And yeah, these were some really, really awesome World Trigger chapters this week. I definitely enjoyed chapter number 246 a lot more than 247 because I think inside of 246 we had a lot of really good ideas brought up about like, hey, here's what your capability is. And from the capability of learning what that is, building up on all of these ideas of like, hey, people who stand still and people who have a clear deadline, like just ways that you can be able to get and make this progress and become more capable as Rokuro is looking for, and having the awareness to understand all of this. Just a lot of really good moments got brought up, and you could probably tell that I enjoyed that chapter more for the main fact of like, hey, I was giving more ideas about like how Rokuro, or how Hyuse's ideas really apply to Rokuro into real life during those moments. And eventually we move on to, of course, chapter number 247, where it's really about Rokuro himself and Rokuro actually realizing what has actually happened within him and how his things have actually gone majorly wrong. Like how he's not the person that he always thought he was this entire time, but in the end, it's going to make him better because of it. Like, it's a really harsh moment when Hyuse goes up to that whiteboard and like grabs Rokuro's puck and moves it from like B rank bottom all the way down to below C rank. Like, it's a really big moment, like, just to see that, and he just says, like, hey, actually this diagram has one thing wrong, and showing Rokuro that it is himself, that he is the one that is wrong in this moment. And then the visual of just, like, his legs crumbling, it's a very good one, but it's all about Rokuro learning his goals and his limits, and knowing that he can subdivide, and that he can do this. Well, the first chapter is more about the capabilities and what he needs to achieve and ways and how he can achieve that, while the second chapter is more about like, hey, we know that Rokuro is going to do that, and here's how he's going to do it. I don't think any chapter was like particularly worse than the other in like a storytelling standpoint, but I definitely enjoyed chapter number 247 a lot more than 240 or 246 a lot more than 247. That is what I was trying to say there. But yeah, just some excellent chapters of World Trigger this week, and I really don't think I have too much more to say about this. I mean, next time we're obviously going to continue on with this whole Rokuro storyline, and being that I have read the next chapter already, I know where it's sort of going, and we do stick with Rokuro, but we also see what a lot of the A-rankers think about Rokuro's situation, which is a very obvious thing for World Trigger to do also, and next chapter is going to be a doozy to cover because yeah, there are so many A-rankers in that chapter, and I barely know all B-ranks names, so it is what it is there. But yeah, great chapter of World Trigger, and I mean, heck, we got 42 pages this month, so it's like as long as a regular monthly chapter, so I'm sure this video is going to be a long one, and yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the World Trigger Christmas special, like we did last year, and heck, next year we'll probably end up doing it again, because hey, I love World Trigger, and I think this is an amazing series, and hey, this is the one thing I want to share with you all on this great day of Christmas. So yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching this video. Of course, I cover plenty of other anime and manga related content on the channel, such as series like a Kagurabachi or Oshinoko, which the last time I recorded one of these videos was still running, and now it has been over for like a month and a half, which is insane to think about. But yeah, I do plenty of other anime manga related content on the channel, so go check out all of that where it is. I think I've got like 12 or 13 other World Trigger videos, which some of those are like the double chapter features like this one is, and some of them are just like, hey, we're just talking about chapter number 245 today or something like that. So I got off that on the channel. You'll catch that in the not only description box down below, but also there's going to be an end card on this video. And with that, yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching. Of course, this was World Trigger chapters number 246 and number 247. Again, titled Rokuro Wakamura Part 2 and Part 3 respectively. And I will catch you guys next time for maybe the away mission test part number 30-something or maybe 40-something. Maybe 40-something. Or I'll be catching you guys next time for Rokuro Wakamura Part 4. Either way, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Hope you guys have a happy holiday season, and yeah. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.